everyone. You're listening to Alternative Revelations with Linda Emmanuel. Today is a special broadcast. As you know, if you listened to my first podcast about the bioweapon that is going to be unleashed on us in 2020, this is what God revealed to me on June 8th. And I have also gotten many confirmations. If nothing else, you'll learn some of the most effective protocols against mycoplasma. So before I get started, I have to say this disclaimer that I am not a doctor, nor can I give medical advice. These podcasts are for informational purposes only. So now I can begin the podcast. And before I get started, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Spanish flu influenza virus of 1918. And this is the organism whose genetic material was put into mycoplasma to weaponize it, just like the AIDS virus, but AIDS is really not a true virus. AIDS is mad cow disease genetic material inside of mycoplasma fermentan. And this is the organism, the Spanish flu virus of 1918, combined with mycoplasma, that will be placed into the flu vaccine of 2020. The following information is from Wikipedia and regards the Spanish flu influenza epidemic of 1918. And it goes as follows. According to Wikipedia, it infected 500 million people around the world, including people in remote Pacific islands and in the Arctic, and resulted in deaths of about 5% of the world population. Now, usually the influenza virus attacks the old and the young, but in this case, it was especially rare because it mostly affected and killed young adults. This influenza epidemic was during World War I. And to keep morale up, the newspapers did not report about the deaths in the flu epidemic. But the only country that reported on it was Spain, and that is how it got its nickname, the Spanish flu, because people thought it was more predominant there. Some groups of researchers suggest that this specific variant of the virus was unusually aggressive, causing a rapidly progressive respiratory failure and death through a cytokine storm, which means an overreaction of the body's immune system. Other scientists believe that this influenza virus of 1918 was no more lethal than any other influenza virus, because in 1918, there was a problem with malnourishment and overcrowded army camps and hospitals and poor hygiene. As to the origins of the flu, there are many speculations, and some believe that the flu originated in the United States. One of these people was a historian by the name of Alfred W. Crosby, who claimed that the flu originated in Kansas. And another popular author by the name of John Barry described Haskell County, Kansas, as the point of origin. It has also been claimed that by late 1917, there had already been a first wave of the epidemic in at least 14 U.S. military camps. This is also very interesting, that we all know that the government forces vaccinations on soldiers, and we all know about the Gulf War syndrome. And we all know that by 1917, there were immunizations. I have no proof of this, but this is the following story is what makes me suspicious that maybe the organism was put in a vaccine and given to the soldiers. And I'm going to read you this from Wikipedia. And I quote, "In the United States, the disease was first observed in Haskell County, Kansas in January 1918, prompting local doctor Lauren Miner to warn the U.S. Public Health Service's academic journal. On the 4th of March in 1918, company cook Albert Gitchell reported sick at Fort Riley, an American military facility that at the time was training American troops during World War I, making him the first recorded victim of the flu. Within days, 522 men at the camp had reported sick. By 11th of March 1918, the virus had reached Queens, New York. Now, failure to take preventative measures in March and April was later criticized. Now, I'm going to continue with the same article. In August of 1918, a more virulent strain appeared simultaneously in France and in the U.S. in Boston, Massachusetts. The Spanish flu also spread through Ireland, carried there by returning Irish soldiers. The Allies of World War I came to call it the Spanish flu primarily because the pandemic received greater press attention after it moved from France to Spain in November of 1918. Spain was not involved in the war and had not imposed wartime censorship. Now, this is also from Wikipedia. Symptoms in 1918 were so unusual that initially influenza was misdiagnosed as dengue, cholera, or typhoid. One observer wrote, "One of the most striking of the complications was hemorrhage from mucous membranes, especially from the nose, stomach, and intestines. Bleeding from the ears and the skin also occurred. The majority of deaths were from bacterial infection, a common secondary infection associated with influenza. The virus also killed people directly by causing massive hemorrhages and edema in the lungs." And this is what caused the deaths of the people in the Dominican Republic and the Fiji Islands with this bioweapon test. I can also remember my grandmother talking about the Spanish flu epidemic because at the time in 1918, my aunt was born during the epidemic, and this is why she was so fearful. This is also from Wikipedia. In 1918, older adults may have had partial protection caused by exposure to the 1889 to 1890 flu pandemic known as the Russian flu. But according to historian John Barry, the most vulnerable of all, those most likely or of the most likely to die, were pregnant women. He reported that in 13 studies of hospitals, women in the pandemic, the death rates ranged from 23% to 71%. Of the pregnant women who survived childbirth, over 1/4 lost their child. Now, this explained to me why my grandmother was so terrified of the flu, because she was pregnant. Now, getting back to a possible bioweapon, what was so unusual about this influenza viral outbreak was that it happened in August or autumn and summer, and usually influenza is unusually worse in the winter. There were 2 waves in this pandemic, and the second wave of the 1918 pandemic was much more deadlier than the first. The first wave had resembled a typical flu epidemic. Those most at risk were the sick and elderly, while younger, healthier people recovered easily. But by August, when the second wave began in France and the United States, the virus had mutated to a much deadlier form. And according to a PBS documentary entitled The American Experience, the influenza 1918 episode says October of 1918 was the deadliest month of the whole pandemic. And here's another quote from Wikipedia. "Even in areas where mortality was low, many adults were incapacitated, that much of everyday life was hampered. Some communities closed all stores, or required customers to leave orders outside. There were reports that healthcare workers could not tend the sick, nor the grave diggers bury the dead because they too were ill. Mass graves were dug by steam shovel and bodies buried without coffins in many places. Now, the following is what makes me so suspicious as to the potential bioweapon being unleashed on us next year. And this is also from Wikipedia. An effort to recreate the 1918 flu strain, which is a subtype of avian strain H1N1, was a collaboration among the American Forces Institute of Pathology, the USDA, ARS Southeast Poultry Research Lab, and Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York City. The effort resulted in the announcement on 5th of October 2005 that the group had successfully determined the virus's genome sequence using historic tissue samples recovered by pathologists from a female flu victim buried in the Alaskan permafrost and samples preserved from American soldiers. And there is your proof that they do have samples of the Spanish flu influenza of 1918. And the following is also very interesting. In June of 2010, a team at the Mount Sinai School of Medicine reported the 2009 flu epidemic vaccine provided some cross protection against the 1918 flu pandemic strain. One of the few things known for certain about the influenza in 1918 and for some years after was that it was out of the laboratory exclusively a disease of human beings. To go on further, in 2013, the AIR Worldwide Research and Modeling Group characterized the historic 1918 pandemic and estimated the effects of a similar pandemic occurring today using the AIR pandemic flu model. In the model, a modern-day Spanish flu event would result in additional life insurance losses of between $15.3 and $27.8 billion in the United States alone, with 188,000 to 337,000 deaths in the United States. I wonder if this is a warning. If you know how these people think, they always try to give us signs or warnings because then they can say, I told you so. Or in other words, I warned you ahead of time. Also, before I get started, I'm going to go over the bioweapon program. They have been testing and releasing bioweapons on us. And the earliest bioweapon test that I've read about is in the 1950s in Punta Gorda, Florida, where the government unleashed hordes of mosquitoes that were infected with mycoplasma. And the people of Punta Gorda, Florida, were the first documented cases of fibromyalgia. And then in the 70s and the 80s, the government got a patent on mycoplasma fermentan and the Visna virus combination, which is mad cow disease. And they got a patent on it, and it was known as AIDS. And they unleashed it onto people through the smallpox vaccines in Africa and in the hepatitis shots to the gays. And they've done weaponized testing on the hantavirus. Lyme disease, of course, is another bioweapon. And for your information, it is in the same family as the organism that causes syphilis. And of course, mycoplasma was another bioweapon. And I have studied these people for the last 16 years. And two telltale signs that it was a bioweapon that was tested in the Dominican Republic and Fiji was this, that these were mysterious deaths. And after a bioweapon is tested, the CDC goes on board, on site, and documents. They are your documenters. And after both incidents, the CDC went down to investigate. And also, they like to do bioweapon tests on islands or places that are confined where they can control the organism. So these all had telltale signs of a bioweapon test at the end of May and June. And also, another clue was this. With this measles scare epidemic, that was a false flag to get people to comply with getting a flu shot next year. That's my take on it. So yes, they are capable of doing this. Now I'm going to get into what these people in the Dominican Republic and Fiji died of. It's what they call cytokine storms. And a cytokine storm is your immune system overreacting to either foreign substances or pathogens that cause disease. I'm going to also read you the symptoms of a cytokine storm, which are as follows: fever, fatigue, loss of appetite, muscle and joint pain, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, rashes, fast breathing, rapid heartbeat, low blood pressure, seizures, headache, confusion, delirium, hallucinations, tremor, and loss of coordination. Further, lab tests and clinical monitoring have shown low blood oxygen, widened pulse pressure, increased cardiac output, which is early stages, potentially diminished cardiac output, which is later, high nitrogen levels in the blood, and excessive bleeding. Now I'm going to read you the symptoms of the couple in the Fiji Islands: nausea and vomiting, sweating and shivering. The woman was laboring to breathe. The husband told or texted his mother that he was too weak to take his wife to the hospital. So he called for a ride, and she died after she got to the hospital on May 25th, and he died 2 days later. Now, there were at least a handful of deaths that were similar in the Dominican Republic. These people died of edema, fluid in the lungs, and also heart attacks, which could have been caused by a cytokine storm. They also had bleeding, which also could have been caused by a cytokine storm. Plus, they all died quickly, as in the case of the Fijis. Now, the following is what causes a cytokine storm, and I'm going to read it from Wikipedia. A cytokine storm occurs when large numbers of white blood cells, including B cells, T cells, and natural killer cells, macrophages, and monocytes, are activated and release inflammatory cytokines, which in turn activate yet more white blood cells. This can occur when the immune system is fighting pathogens, as cytokines signal immune cells such as T cells and macrophages to travel to the site of infection. In addition, cytokines activate those cells, stimulating them to produce even more cytokines. Further, at the site of infection, there's always inflammation. This is your immune system trying to contain the pathogen from spreading. So this causes edema, which is fluid buildup. And the victim usually either suffocates or drowns in their own fluid. And since the lungs are filling up with fluid, they can no longer take in oxygen, and this deprives cells of oxygen and can cause heart attacks or strokes, leading to death. And obviously, both Fiji Island victims and Dominican Republic victims showed signs of cytokine storms and dying either from heart attacks or fluid buildup in their lungs, leading to heart attack or stroke and death. And now that I'm finished with the explanation and description of the Spanish flu influenza virus of 1918, I'm going to reveal the protocols that God revealed to me that will protect me from the bioweapon that will be put in the flu vaccine next year, 2020. The following are the 5 protocols God confirmed that will protect me from the mycoplasma weaponized with the Spanish flu influenza virus of 1918. The first one is cyanogenic glycosides, and I did a podcast on cyanogenic glycosides. I think it was the 4th one. For more detail about how cyanogenic glycosides work, I won't go through that in this podcast. It was extensively done in podcast 4, and it's called cyanogenic glycosides. And this is very accessible, this protocol. Another way to protect myself is a biomat. A biomat gets up to 158 degrees, and mycoplasma dies at 150. And for your information, Steven Spielberg owns a biomat. The next one is raw garlic. It has to be raw because when garlic is cooked, this destroys the potency of the sulfur compounds and is ineffective against mycoplasma and other pathogens. Sulfur also travels to the lungs to be excreted from the body. My friend tells me she uses tomato juice as a carrier for the garlic. She uses a garlic press and squeezes all the juice out of 1 clove of garlic, puts it in 4 ounces of tomato juice, and drinks it this way. She tells me the tomato juice hides the taste of the garlic. The next one is Golden Seal, and this is my favorite. And I bought for myself Golden Seal extract that can be nebulized. And I got my nebulizer on eBay. I didn't have to have a prescription to buy my nebulizer on eBay. If I would have wanted to buy one from, let's say, Walgreens, I would have had to have a prescription. I also bought my Golden Seal extract on Amazon, and there were many choices, and God directed me to buy the one that was called Secret of the Tribe, and that's spelled Tribe, Secret of the Tribe. I don't know why God specifically told me to buy this one, but there's many choices. This one is alcohol free, and I bought the 4-ounce bottle that I'm going to share with my friends. Also, I did a whole podcast on berberine, and I don't know the number of the podcast. I think it is called the Queen of All Protocols, which is berberine. The most potent alkaloid out there is berberine, and Golden Seal contains berberine. I also buy my capsules of Golden Seal at Walmart. A bottle of 50 capsules is $5.99. I will also put the link to the Golden Seal extract that I bought off of Amazon, Secret of the Tribe. It will be in the description of this podcast. Now, there are actually 6 total protocols that can fight this influenza mycoplasma bioweapon, and it is oil of oregano. And this just got revealed to me about a couple weeks ago. And you can buy the extract of oregano on Amazon. And I was directed to buy this certain wild oregano because in the root of the oregano, what makes it so potent is berberine. Berberine is in the root of the wild oregano. So I will have that link in the description of this podcast for the specific oil of oregano that I got. And yes, you can nebulize this. And the whole concept is to get the extract into the lungs by nebulizing it to kill the pathogen directly. I would also like to add that I do not use full strength on the extracts in the nebulizer. I put about 10 drops of the extract into the nebulizer cup, and then I add distilled or purified water to fill it to the line. I just thought I'd add that little detail. And if a person does not have a nebulizer, you can also buy an injector that you can squirt up through the nose to reach the lungs. And I will have a link to Amazon where you can purchase this applicator where you insert it through the nose. And this can be used for oil of oregano and golden seal extract and mild silver protein, which is next. The last way God told me to protect myself is mild silver protein. And if you remember from the first podcast, that is how I got well from my mycoplasma infection. Mild silver protein was invented around the turn of the century, back around 1900, and it was used all the way through to World War II in the 40s when they developed antibiotics and sulfa drugs. And this was all monetary. The pharmaceuticals had no way to make money off of silver because they weren't able to patent it. Silver has been used as a disinfectant for thousands of years, and usage of silver dates back to 6,000 years ago when people ate off of silver plates and they drank out of silver chalices. And I'm going to put links on my description where you can buy mild silver protein. I've seen it on Amazon, and I'm also going to put links to articles about mild silver protein, and also an article on Wikipedia about the original mild silver protein called Argyrol. And I will do a podcast on mild silver protein. And if I had a child, this would be my choice because this is safe for both children and pets. And I can nebulize the mild silver protein, or I can snort it up my nose with an injector, and it goes right to the lungs and can kill the pathogen. Mild silver protein is also what I use to reverse my macular degeneration along with flaxseed oil. So that ends this podcast, but I will be having more podcasts on this subject if the need arises. This is probably the most difficult podcast I've ever released. And since our country has a history of unleashing bioweapons on us, it is very sensible to know and be knowledgeable about the tools that can protect you from cancer and disease, especially pathogens like mycoplasma. And the Lyme spirochete, which is also a bioweapon unleashed on us in the 80s and 90s through ticks. Now there's one more thing that God revealed to me. How are the elite going to protect themselves from this epidemic next year? If you're interested, go to Google and type in these two words, fusion inhibitors, and that is your answer. How the elite plan to protect themselves from this bioweapon. And I have a little time to go over what fusion inhibitors are, and I will also place the link where I got my information about fusion inhibitors. Now, before I get into what fusion inhibitors are, I have to explain a little bit of myth that the medical industry has done. Now, I'm going to make it kind of a funny story. If somebody tells you, points to a duck and tells you that's a duck, it quacks like a duck, it walks like a duck, so it is a duck. So now you come upon, let's say, a goose instead of a duck. And you say, well, it quacks like a duck, it looks like a duck, then it's a duck. But no, it's a little bit different than that duck. So instead of calling it a duck, let's call it a retro duck instead. So that's what these scientists have done. They think that AIDS is a virus, but the truth of the matter is AIDS is a mycoplasma. It is a cell wall deficient bacterium. It is the nucleus of a bacteria that has been inserted with the viral genome property. So scientists are told, AIDS is a virus. Now, all of a sudden, they come upon mycoplasma. It is a little bit different than the AIDS genetic material. So instead of calling it AIDS, they call mycoplasma a retrovirus, and that's where it gets confusing. So whenever you see the word retrovirus, that is mycoplasma. And of course, before I get into fusion inhibitors, I have to explain something else. That every cell in your body is connected by protein. Protein keeps the cells together. And you might want to know what cell in the body has the most protein receptors. And I'll tell you that at the end of this description. So again, every cell in your body has protein receptors on it, and that's how they all stick together. Or in other words, stay attached to each other. So mycoplasma too has protein receptors on its membrane. That is how it attaches to the cell wall so it can invade a cell. And I'm going to try to simplify it as much as I can. The Illuminati, or actually Pfizer, one of the pharmaceutical companies, invented a fusion or entry inhibitor that blocks mycoplasma's protein receptors from attaching to a cell. It can therefore not invade the cell, and the person stays infection free. Now, that doesn't mean that the organism dies. They still can be a carrier. Like in the old days, you've probably heard about Typhoid Mary. There's a long explanation about why Typhoid Mary could not get sick, but that is the explanation. These fusion inhibitors block the mycoplasma receptors, the protein receptors, from binding with the cell wall in the body. And it's that simple, kind of simplified. And since they describe these fusion inhibitors as retroviral inhibitors, in my opinion, this means that it applies to retroviruses, which is basically mycoplasma. That's simple. So if you're wondering what cell in the body has the most protein receptors of all, it's really only in one type of body. That's the female. The fertilized egg has more receptors, protein receptors, on its outer wall than any other cell in the body. And if you think about it, it has to attach to that uterus, and it needs more protein receptors to make sure that life goes on, that life continues. Sometime I'll do a podcast on enzyme therapy. It's really, really interesting. I have a chapter in my book on this about Dr. Beard, who is the father of embryology. It's a most interesting story. And it is related to the aforementioned topic about protein receptors. And my book is available on Amazon.com for $14.99, or you can visit my website, www.lindaemmanuel.com, for more information and other subjects about heart disease, the cause of heart disease, macular degeneration, and a lot more. So that ends this podcast, and I hope you learned something. If Hopefully we will not be under attack next year with a bioweapon in the flu vaccine. But if we do, you know how I'll protect myself. I can't tell you what to do, but I can pass on the information to you as an informational podcast. I'd also like to add that there's so many topics to cover, and if you have one that you want to learn about, you can drop me an email. I will put my email address in the description of the podcast for show suggestions, because I have so much to cover. It's hard to figure out which one to do next. There's so many. So, until next time, good night and God bless.